If you grew up hearing that Jamaica's African roots were mostly Ashanti, mostly Gold Coast, you were only getting half the story. Because according to the actual shipping records of the transatlantic slave trade, one single group was forced onto more ships bound for Jamaica than almost any other in the entire Atlantic world: the Igbo. But here's where it gets complicated. When scientists finally tested the DNA of Jamaicans today, the results didn't match the shipping records. And the reason why is one of the most brutal, most overlooked stories in Caribbean history. If hidden history like this matters to you, subscribe now. Because we're about to walk through records most people have never seen. For most of the 20th century, colonial-era historians described pre-contact West African societies, including the Igbo, as stateless, fragmented, without complex political organization, without cities, without a documented civilization worth studying. This wasn't a small detail. It was used as justification. If a people had no real history before Europeans arrived, then colonization could be framed as bringing civilization rather than destroying one. Igbo society was specifically singled out this way, more than most, because unlike some West African kingdoms, the Igbo historically organized in a decentralized system. No single monarch ruling over all Igbo-speaking peoples. To colonial anthropologists, that reads as primitive. To the Igbo, it was a deliberate, sophisticated system of village democracy and council governance that had worked for centuries. But there was a problem with the no real history claim. It was about to be dug up, literally. In the late 1930s, and more thoroughly in excavations through the 1950s, archaeologists working near the town of Igbo-Ukwu in southeastern Nigeria uncovered something nobody expected. Elaborate bronze and leaded bronze artifacts, ceremonial vessels, ornaments, ritual objects, crafted with a level of metallurgical skill that stunned researchers. These weren't recent. Dating placed them as far back as the 9th century AD, roughly 500 years before European contact with West Africa, and centuries before some of the more famous African kingdoms Western textbooks did choose to acknowledge. The sophistication of the casting technique, the evidence of long-distance trade networks, bringing in materials like glass beads, all pointed to something the stateless, primitive narrative had no room for: a complex, wealthy, technologically advanced society, centuries before colonization. The evidence had been in the ground the whole time. Nobody had bothered to look, because the story had already been decided in advance. So the archaeology already proved the primitive society myth wrong. But that's not even the part of this story that involves DNA. The real twist, the one that connects directly to Jamaica, happens 500 years later, on slave ships. And what the records say versus what the DNA says do not match. Let's get into it. Here's what the historical shipping data actually says. The Voyage's Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, the most comprehensive record of slave ship crossings ever assembled, shows that the Bight of Biafra, the coastal region dominated by Igbo-speaking communities, provided more enslaved people to Jamaica than any other single African region. To put a number on it, researchers estimate the Bight of Biafra accounted for roughly 1 in 6 enslaved Africans across the entire Atlantic trade, and Jamaica specifically, after Virginia, was the single largest destination for people forced out of that region. Some historians estimate that as much as 80% of the people loaded onto ships from the Bight of Biafra's ports were Igbo-speaking. The heaviest wave hit late, largely between 1790 and 1807, right before Britain's abolition of the trade, which means a huge number of the enslaved Africans who built the last major generation of forced labor in Jamaica before abolition were Igbo. If you only read the shipping manifests, the conclusion seems obvious. Jamaica's African ancestry should be overwhelmingly Igbo. That is not what the DNA says. A genetic study examining the mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, of present-day Jamaicans, published in the academic journal Slavery and Abolition, set out to answer a simple question. Which West African region actually left the largest surviving genetic footprint in Jamaica today? The answer surprised the researchers themselves. It wasn't the Bight of Biafra. The evidence pointed to the Gold Coast, the region associated with Akan and Coromantee peoples, as the largest single surviving maternal lineage in the Jamaican population today. This doesn't mean the shipping records were wrong. The numbers of people forced onto ships from the Bight of Biafra were real and enormous. What it means is something far darker. Not everyone who was trafficked survived to leave descendants at the same rate. Mortality on Middle Passage crossings, brutal conditions on plantations, disease, and the specific documented harshness of labor regimes assigned to different groups all shaped who lived long enough and had children who lived long enough to be counted in a DNA sample 4 centuries later. In other words, the shipping manifest tells you who was taken. The DNA tells you who survived. And in Jamaica, those are 2 different stories layered on top of each other. This is the part most people never learn. Not because it's hidden on purpose, but because it takes 2 completely different fields of research, decades apart, to even see it. If your family has Jamaican roots, comment below what you were taught growing up about your ancestry. I want to see how many of you were taught the Akan version, the Igbo version, or neither. Because here's the thing. Surviving in the DNA numbers and surviving culturally are not the same measurement either. Igbo cultural fingerprints are still deeply embedded in Jamaican life, independent of what any genetic sample shows. Linguists have traced the Jamaican patois word nyam, meaning to eat, back to Igbo origins, a word still used every single day across the island and the diaspora, often by people with no idea of its root. The term Red Igbo or Redibo, historically used in Jamaica to describe lighter-skinned black Jamaicans, is directly tied to Igbo ancestry and reputation on the island, a linguistic fossil of a specific ethnic identity that colonial record keepers tried to flatten into a single, undifferentiated category. Slave. Even Haiti carries a trace of this same legacy. There's a Haitian Creole saying, "No say Igbo," meaning, "We are Igbo," a phrase that persisted long after anyone kept formal records of who came from where. None of this shows up on a DNA test. It shows up in how people talk, cook, and mourn, which is a reminder that ancestry isn't only counted in percentages, it's also carried in language, in memory, in things nobody wrote down on a shipping manifest. So which is it? Were the Igbo central to Jamaica's story or peripheral? The honest answer is both, depending on what you're measuring. Central to the raw numbers of who was forced across the Atlantic in Jamaica's final decades of slavery. Present, but not dominant, in the surviving maternal genetic line, and still very much alive in language and cultural memory today. That complexity is exactly what the stateless, primitive society with no real history myth was designed to erase in the first place. The idea that African history, African identity, was simple enough to summarize in one sentence. It never was. Not in Igbo-Ukwu in the 9th century, and not on a plantation ledger in 1805. The Igbo weren't a footnote, and they weren't the whole story either. They were one thread in something far more layered than either the ship's manifest or a DNA report could capture on its own. If this changed how you think about your own ancestry, hit subscribe. We're going deeper into the diaspora's hidden history next. And drop a comment. Had you ever heard of Igbo-Ukwu or the word nyam before today.